Welcome to Our Nation Today. I'm K.R. Davidson. Thanks for joining us as we look at the stories behind the headlines. The Bank of Canada says that it has growing concerns around the ever-increasing household debt. The bank's governor says Canadians should be cautious about buying homes they can't afford in the middle of a crisis. Among other concerns listed in the 2021 Financial System Review includes the ongoing threats posed by cyber attacks, a changing climate, and the unknowns of cryptocurrencies. Okay, this seems like it's covering off every subject we've covered off in the last few weeks, and now we get to throw household debt into the mix. What I found was really interesting is that you actually saw the consumer debt levels have dropped over the last year, as has the bankruptcy. And I think that we're taking a look at some artificial numbers there, because I think that some of the government measures have stemmed that. But let's talk a little bit about what the Bank of Canada is saying. What are some of the concerns that they're highlighting on this debt hold issue?
I mean, I think you highlighted some of the major points right off the top there. I mean, household debt you're seeing debt go down in some ways, but what they're saying is bad mortgages are increasing, and so that's a big concern for them. Increasingly, there's two key household vulnerabilities: high household indebtedness, and of course, imbalances in the housing market. So both of these factors are being taken into account. I mean, you're seeing a roaring housing market across Canada right now.
Record high price. Like we're taking a look at the average price in April was just $696,000. Like these aren't even real numbers anymore. Where you're taking a look at the average price is $700,000.
That's the average, right? So there's on the high end and the low end. So it's astonishing to me. Yeah. So
the bank's saying that there needs to be a greater stress test in play. That there should be a push up to 5.25%. So if we're seeing interest rates rise, some of these issues will be addressed. Last week we were talking about issues with inflation, and the way that the bank cures that is raising interest rates. So obviously this is great. We don't want to see a repeat of what the U.S. experienced in 2008 with their housing crisis. But
right.
What are some of the other issues that are playing into this, and some of the other concerns?
And I mean, credit to the drafters of the report. If I was able to muddle my way through, if you're at all interested, highly recommend.
If you're
an
economist in waiting, it's a great report.
Great idea. But the main point being in this entire situation is the concern around your households is growing about the vulnerabilities related to mortgages and to how they're going to play out if interest rates rise. And so I think the government and the Bank of Canada are saying, look, hey, the economy is recovering, but at the same time, we got to be cautious about the future because rates could go up.
So I think we're dealing with a myriad of issues that are coming together. Number one, you're seeing young adults that actually can't get into the housing market because we've got an inventory that's at record lows. And I can even take a look at myself. Normally I might vacation, maybe I'll go down to Florida, but now you're looking somewhere else. And what we're seeing here is this is different than I think the 2015 issue where we saw housing prices skyrocketing in Toronto and Vancouver.
Right.
Now we're starting to see this cover off into municipalities outside of those regions.
And to your point, they're seeing the same sort of trends that were happening in 2016. That brought in the 2016 measures, the stress tests. And they're seeing those happening again, but across more cities in Canada and more regions. So that is a big concern. And you're talking about breaking into the market. There's concerns around your various different types of loans, your loans, to interest and loans to value. So
and I think some of the bank's concerns is, we might have light at the end of the tunnel here, but we're definitely not out of the woods. And so the question is, what happens if something else comes to disturb the market?
And this is a couple of their other factors that they brought in. There could be one triggering factor internationally that could cause rates to go up. This
and
geopolitical
take a look at what's been
factor,
happening with cryptocurrencies.
Well,
right?
exactly, or even cyber attacks, which is one of the other things they mentioned. A cyber attack to a major pipeline. What about that?
Yeah,
that'll have a massive impact on the economy.
Yeah, very much. When you combine record high demand with record low inventory, you create the perfect recipe for skyrocketing housing prices. And with this comes the associated debt. More concerning than the debt is not being able to service that debt if there's a shift in the economy. We only need to look back to the 2008 U.S. housing market crisis to understand the lesson of extending too much credit for the escalating house prices and the consequences that flow from this. The government should continue to work with the Bank of Canada to ensure the stability of Canada's housing market and to ensure that Canadians are not unnecessarily saddled with debt they cannot service. Stay with us. When we come back, we'll look at a court challenge to the federal government's classification of plastic as toxic. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. A group of leaders in the plastics industry are challenging the government's decision to label plastic goods as toxic. The Responsible Plastic Use Coalition says the designation was not made for scientific reasons. Instead, it is arguing that the classifying of plastic as toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is part of a political agenda. The coalition is instead urging for improving recycling efforts to deal with the issue of plastic waste. This is interesting because when you start to wade into it, I think it starts to go to the heart of a problem we have here in Canada, where our recycling programs are ineffective at best. And you can take a look, the government's starting to deal with this because I think the reports say only about 9% of the plastic that goes towards recycling actually gets recycled and ends up in the landfill. So they're looking for a solution to this. Give us a little bit more of the backdrop, give us an understanding of this coalition that's come together for this application before the federal court.
Right. So according to the report that you mentioned too, for the Environment and Climate Change Canada, about 9%, commissioned in 2018, or came out 2019, about 9% of what we actually recycle is recycled. So, it's a staggeringly low number for
It's
I think a lot of people,
right?
who spend a lot of time.
I take a look. I sort every day. We've got these 4 separate bins.
Exactly.
And we take great
I was
efforts
about to say,
rinse it.
there's a lot of people who spend a lot of time and are very conscientious about sorting things appropriately, and
obviously
find
we've
that
heard
most of that.
some pretty significant news stories about
Of us shipping our Canadian garbage out there. So, all that to say, I think, so the government took a stand early on in its mandate saying we want to get rid of single-use plastics. So they use the rule of classifying plastic manufactured products as toxic.
Okay, so you've got this industry coalition that's come together.
Responsible Plastic Use Coalition.
Yeah, so in fact, this coalition actually just came together at the eve or the onset of this new classification. So they're going to bring this challenge to the court. But basically, we're seeing that now all plastic is deemed as toxic. And I think that they're arguing that there's some confusion here because we take a look at PVCs and other uses of plastic that actually are used quite well within our industries and such.
What they were saying, it's not even, there's no confusion. They're saying this is part of a political agenda. It's not based on science, right? So they're taking a very strong stand on this.
It's too bad because when you take a look at it, you can see there's a great necessity to make sure that we don't continually have our recycling initiatives end up in the landfill. And you can see politically, I think everybody can get behind that.
Right.
But when you just wholesale use a regulation to be able to deal with that, a
blanket ban rarely has the effect of that I think people are looking for. So,
And when I was looking at this, and I think we're starting to take a look at a much greater issue in how do we operate our economy. When I was a kid, everybody had the same telephone. You'd have Bell Canada telephone. It lasted forever. If it ever did break down, you'd have a technician came down. They would be able to replace it. Now, I take a look at 2 things in the last week. I wanted to be able to replace it with parts, but I can't. You've got to throw out things wholesale.
Right.
So I think the Netherlands
is part of that linear economy, right?
Linear
Which is
economy.
Take, make, throw away.
Okay, so tell us what the Netherlands is doing, because they're using a circular economy, which is probably a little bit more reminiscent of our past.
Right. Effectively just using all the pieces that we have as many times as we can. Reducing waste is actually a byproduct to the system, which is just to always find efficiencies and to intentionally draft or create things in a way that they can be used again in different ways.
That's really interesting because from the onset of the manufacturing, they're actually taking a look at how do I make this part to be reused at the latter part, and I think that we're missing that.
An integrated economy in a lot of ways, right? And I know that a lot of the plastics coalition people are saying we need more of an integrated economy when it comes to recycling. There's a tremendous amount of money in it. There's about, they say that it's billions of dollars lost in opportunities from this recycling by throwing things away wholesale.
And we actually saw that we were moving there with I think they call it some of our, the secondary resin markets or whatever the case may be. But once the oil prices tanked, these compete with the primary, and then all of a sudden you can't compete.
Right.
So I think that there's there's this necessity for a rethink and some leadership to be able to go, okay, what are those reforms that have to come in?
Right.
Because it's a bit of a blunt instrument
and is a ban
here.
a reform?
Yeah,
right.
That's right. While it is both necessary and prudent to address the issue of the amount of plastics entering our landfills, The approach on addressing the problem is just as important as deciding to act on the issue in the first instance. The real issue is not whether or not plastics are toxic, but rather whether our economy should shift from being a linear economy to a circular economy. The latter is what is desired to allow for long-term sustainability, but using a blunt instrument to get there will likely serve as a distraction rather than serving as a vehicle towards required reform. Stay with us. When we come back, we'll be looking at an Ontario court decision that has found that Iran committed an intentional act of terrorism by firing missiles at Flight 752. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. The Ontario Superior Court of Justice has ruled that Iran has committed an intentional act of terrorism. Justice Edward Belaboba found that missiles that struck Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 in January 2020 were fired deliberately. His ruling means that Iran's immunity against civil litigation is invalidated. The lawsuit was filed by 4 people who lost loved ones in the attack. Over 100 of the 176 people killed in the plane had ties to Canada. So let's take a look at this decision. Can you give us a little bit of background? What was before the courts, and is this usual for us to be having an Ontario, a provincial court ruling on something of this magnitude?
International and national magnitude for sure. 55 Canadian citizens in that, 30 permanent residents, and many others with other ties to Canada and Ukraine flights, international airlines.
So the flight was departing from Tehran.
Departing from Tehran. If you recall, at the time there was a lot of growing tension around the leader of the Quds Revolutionary Guard force,
which is
the external operating arm of the IRGC, of the Iranian Revolution.
And Canada's just labeled them as a terrorist organization.
Right, and so there's more concerns around whether the whole IRGC should be designated
there's a motion before the House that actually has asked for that. It
passed, actually, but so far no action has been taken by the government.
There's some questions on why the government's hesitating.
Why is there a delay on this, right? Especially given that.
So sorry, bring us back to this ruling.
So
please.
That's the backstory on that. So now we're getting into the actual case itself, where this was brought up by four people who lost loved ones in the plane crash.
Yep.
And this is an unusual motion in a lot of ways, but it's not a criminal case, and I think you might be able to speak a little bit more accurately to distinction there.
Yeah, sure. So there's criminal litigation or criminal proceedings, and there's civil litigation. So, and I think a lot of people are actually asking for an international criminal tribunal to be set up to be dealing with this, and I think that that's appropriate. What this allows for is there's a State Immunity Act which protects states from being sued from Canadians.
Right.
And so the justice in this case said, because Iran's been found to have conducted terrorist acts, now people can actually sue Iran for any assets that they hold in Canada.
Right.
And so now there's a question: is there any significant assets to what we call attach to or enforce your judgment? Iran's already offered $100,000 US as of $150,000 US to each of the families last year. So there's going to be some sort of compensation, and I think that there's a government report that's forthcoming on their investigation that's coming out quite soon.
Right, and I mean the judgment or the justice based his decision on the facts that were provided by the UN Special Rapporteur to the human rights,
as well as Special Advisor Ralph Goodell.
Right, former minister. Both of whom said it was effectively putting in paraphrasing, it was inconceivable that this could have been an accident. The level of moving parts.
Iran's position is that they were going to conduct their own investigation, but then they've sort of
they said this was a complete accident. We had no control over this. To now we may have actually
And then they're trying to blame it on somebody else. But
exactly.
This is a significant issue. I know Foreign Affairs Minister Marc Garneau is starting to advocate internationally for the Safe Skies initiative. I looked at some of the reports and trying to get an understanding, like, what does this mean? How do you use this? We had the Malaysia flight incident
and I think the political opposition, and as well as some interest groups around the country, are saying, look, just label the IRGC as a terrorist organization. It's already a unique creature in Iran. It's effectively, in a lot of ways, acting like a state within a state.
Well, and why don't you give it a little bit of background for the viewers? Because basically Iran's operating with two military forces.
Well, exactly, and one with more sizable influence than the other. So,
which operates under the Ayatollah Khomeini, the Supreme
right,
Commander.
it's effectively a sort of religious police force, is the way it started up, and has emerged as a way for the Ayatollah to keep control over various facets of the economy, public life, and even the armed forces themselves, the Iranian armed forces, which are distinct and separate from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
Well, it'd be interesting to see how the government responds to this and how they respond to the labeling of.
I mean, the House decided already that this should be happening. So,
interesting. When state actors participate in terrorism, it is appropriate to ensure that the actions are held to account. It is hoped that Canada's anticipated release of their investigative findings on the intentional downing of Flight 752 will, in coordination with other member countries, allow for increased pressure on Iran to ensure that this will not occur again. It will also be interesting to see how Canada's Safer Skies initiative translates into something that substantively prevents acts like this from occurring in the future. Stay with us. When we return, we'll be looking at the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and reactions from the international community. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire on Thursday, May 20th, and to date, the ceasefire has held. Israel's security cabinet approved the Egyptian-mediated proposal, and Hamas said it would honor the deal. The deal brought to an end 11 days of hostilities that caused reverberations around the world. So I know we were talking about this last week, and there's a group of international leaders coming together to be able to deal with this so that this wouldn't burgeon out into a full-fledged war. We see Egypt has stepped into a place of mediating. Obviously, there is some pretty strong influence coming from the U.S. To curb this. Give us a little bit of background on this ceasefire and what you're seeing.
Right. So Israel's Security Council announced Thursday, late Thursday, that a deal had been made. Hamas follows shortly thereafter with saying they'll respect the ceasefire, and it took effect on Friday. It's more or less held fairly much without incident, without significant incident anyway. So
yeah, Israel's statement is the quiet will be met with quiet.
Right.
So.
Yeah. The defense minister Benny Gantz says the situation on the ground will determine the continuation of the campaign. Which some people are saying is this what does that mean? But as long as rockets aren't
firing. It appears that the Palestinians are actually taking the brunt of the losses here. There are about 12 people that have been reported that were killed in Israel, but over 230 Palestinians and lots of children here. So it appears that there was this great cry to bring an end to this because innocent civilians are getting killed.
Right.
But let's take a look at some of the substantive issues at play.
And I think it's important to note there's almost two distinct campaigns going on in this, what we're calling a war for, I think, just our own classification system. So Hamas, which is a registered terrorist organization, has been lobbying rockets into civilian centers, which is against international laws of armed conflict, right?
Yeah.
Most of those are getting intercepted, not all. So they're lobbying them in against the state of Israel. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is responding to Hamas, the terrorist organization, who happens to have most of its elements dispersed among the civilian population.
Sure.
Some people say it is using civilians as shields. They say they're protecting their assets from Israeli destruction.
So let's take a look. Obviously, the U.S. has an interest here, but it appears that we were getting a lot of people coming into the mix. China is providing foreign aid to Palestine. So you're seeing that this the focus where President Biden wanted to focus on domestic issues is starting to move over to Middle East focused again. And so we have Secretary of State Blinken is actually heading over to continue. What are some of the underlying issues that he's going to be navigating with the two groups? Obviously, we've got the settlement, the West Bank.
Right, and I think that can't be understated as a factor in this whole dispute. The discussion over where that whole process is going, and of course what the Prime Minister in Israel is going to be doing about that. But if you looked at what the U.S. was saying, they're saying, look, we're providing aid to the Palestinian people. We're not giving aid to Hamas. We'll be giving it through international organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that whole aspect going on. While at the same time, you're seeing this has been a bit of a politicized issue by different factors, not only in the Middle East, but around the world. Like you said, China getting involved could be a bit of a chance to show their leadership.
And honestly,
Arab world, too.
we're in the Middle East here, so Iran is in the mix, and
Yep.
there's some political changes that are in the midst in Iran, which obviously will have an influence on what's happening.
I mean, there's a couple things. If you recall a while ago, there was the explosion at the nuclear plant. They blame Israel. They say they're going to get revenge. Hamas is, of course, supplied and funded by Iran in part.
Yes.
So there's tremendous amount of influence from Iranian officials on that regard as well. So, and they have a presidential election coming up in June. So,
with some old names
yeah,
coming from the past. So.
Right. The former president who actually denies the Holocaust is throwing his name into the hat again. He was approved for running again. So it's an interesting little go of things.
Well, we'll continue to take a look at some of the voices from the international actors that are going to be able to come in to be able to quell this, and I think that's what we'll be looking for in weeks ahead. It is with sadness that innocent lives were lost in this continuation of hostilities between these two factions. It is, however, noteworthy to acknowledge the international leadership that stepped forward to encourage an end to the unnecessary conflict. With Israel's principle that quiet will be met with quiet, we will now look on to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who will work with the parties to quell the underlying issues and provide hope for the future with both Israel and Palestine. Both Nathaniel and I would like to thank you for watching Our Nation Today. And remember, keep examining and know that you are part of the solution.